Hello and welcome to Adepicos Online. We're looking at Module 5 plot of the overall learning journey of how to lead, and we're looking at Step 2, the master story. Master stories matter for leaders because they enable them to create a meaningful work environment. Today, one of the most important things that we can have for enabling high-performing teams and high-performing organizations is to provide an authentic and truly meaningful work environment. And to understand why that is, we can look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow created the pyramid in front of you, in which he described 8 basic needs that we need to have met, ranked in order of primary importance. What primary importance means is there's obviously a necessity to have food and water in order to make it through the day. So that's obviously the most important need, and that's why it's a physiological function at the base of the pyramid. The next thing that we need is to have a safe environment, and then as you can see, we go up the pyramid. He drew a crucial distinction between what is shaded in light purple and dark purple. So at the lower 4 needs are what he called needs of deficiency. In other words, if we don't have enough of those, if we don't reach a certain minimum threshold, we're going to suffer greatly. So obviously if we don't have enough food and water or enough safety, then we're not going to be happy. On the other side, at the top of the pyramid, we have growth needs. And so these are needs that we have in which the goal is to generate as much as possible. So once we've secured our basic deficiency needs, the challenge of our lives is then to maximize our growth needs. And these are our needs for knowledge, aesthetics, self-actualization, and transcendence. The reason why it's so important to have a meaningful work environment is that speaks to the highest 3 needs: our need for aesthetics, our need for self-actualization, and above all, our need for transcendence are answered by providing a meaningful environment. What does that mean? What it means is that 21st century leaders need to focus on getting people to work in an environment which is highly meaningful. And a crucial way in which they can do that is by creating effective master stories. And this module is going to introduce you to that idea and give you some basic tools for doing that effectively. As always, we can understand this concept through the lens of the football team. Fans love their teams because of the stories that those teams generate. They don't just simply support their team to watch a good game of football, although obviously that does matter. But it's the overall journey that team has gone through, their struggles to win the championships, their crushing defeats and exhilarating victories, their journey of going from maybe to be a humble team to be one of the greatest teams in the world. The master story guides the team and unifies the fan base. Of course, everyone wants to watch great football, but passionate fans are much more committed to the overall story, the meaningful environment that team creates. And the reason why that matters is that's what drives the passion of the fans above all else. The fans connect to something much greater than them, and it's right there that we can see that need for transcendence that we saw at the top of the pyramid in the previous slide. Transcendence is about working for something greater to yourself, connecting to something that's much more meaningful than just your everyday life. And that's what a story allows. It's a vehicle through which millions of people can connect to the overall story of one football team and its journey to winning the championship, for example. And so in the same way, effective leaders build effective stories that inspire, unite, and provide meaningful environments which focus their team and get them to be as passionate about their organization as football fans are about their football teams. And a great example of this is Earth Day. So Earth Day and the Earth Day flag, which you see in front of you, the planet Earth on a purple background, created out of many different stories. And this is where we're going to understand the concept of the master narrative. Because before Earth Day, there were many different environmental organizations around the world, and particularly that were emerging in the US. And these were emerging in response to a variety of environmental challenges. For example, nuclear test, oil spills, chemical pollution, so on and so forth. And as the environmental organizations grew, they each had their individual story, but what they were lacking was one master story. Today we're very familiar with the concept of environmentalism and sustainability, but 40, 50 years ago, those were very niche concepts. There was no overall idea of the environment or something like that. And so what Earth Day became was a way to unite all the different environmental concerns under one banner, that of Earth Day itself. And what happened is that Earth Day became the master narrative of many different environmental movements. So it didn't matter if you were passionate about oil spills or nuclear testing, everyone could come together under the rallying cry of Earth Day and fight to make a better environment. Now that's important for us today because one of the greatest imperatives that we have, particularly as 21st century leaders, is to find a way to build sustainable societies and sustainable organizations. But the very concept of sustainability has emerged out of the narrative that came from Earth Day. So what that really means is that we had environmental movements that started, and then they were united under the master story of Earth Day. And then in turn, that master story of Earth Day got people talking about how important it is to protect the environment, how important it is to preserve it for future generations, but also, just as important, to make sure that our current generations don't descend into a living hellhole, but have a beautiful planet, an enjoyable planet to live on. And out of that conversation, the concept of sustainability started to emerge. And from there, we've moved on to our current understanding of sustainability as being crucial for the overall viability of our modern-day civilization. And so here we can see the real power of narrative. And I think it's really nicely described by Dr. Polkington. The narrative scheme serves as a lens through which the apparently independent and disconnected elements of existence are seen as related parts of a whole. Thus, plots give meaning and connection that would otherwise be absent. What that means is the story or the narrative unifies what are otherwise very random elements. So to use the example of Earth Day, whereas before we had one organization fighting against oil spills and another environmental organization fighting for cleaner air and another environmental organization to fight for deforestation, what the master narrative of Earth Day did and the master narrative of sustainability, it's connected all those seemingly independent elements and united them into a meaningful whole. And by doing that, it becomes far more meaningful and far more powerful. And that's where we can start to drill into what we really understand stories to be. Because as Dr. Pamela Rutledge describes, stories are actually how we think. They're the way that we give meaning to life. Regardless of the terms that we use, stories are our ideas of how we explain how things work, how we make decisions, how we justify our decisions to persuade others, how we understand our place in the world, the identities that we create, and how we define and teach social values. In other words, social stories define reality because they describe reality. And that's why they're so important for a 21st century leader. Because by building a powerful organizational story, a story that describes in an authentic and meaningful way, what are we working towards? Why are we working towards it? You are able to describe a very exciting reality that people can connect to and be inspired by, and enable them to move up the hierarchy of needs to reach the level of transcendence. Now you might be thinking, that sounds really nice, but completely fluffy and not really very important for the practicalities of the day-to-day. Well, that is simply not accurate, because one of the greatest challenges in the workplace today is employee engagement, or if we turned it around, employee disengagement. Now what that means is that people simply are not interested in their work anymore. They don't really engage with what it is to go to the workplace in the day-to-day. They simply perform it in a mind-numbing way and they go home. And this problem of employee engagement is a huge problem that strikes all sectors. And the reason why it's such a problem is it reduces productivity. So the key challenge is to find a way to engage employees and to enable them to unlock their full creative capability to be as productive as possible. And you're not going to do that by paying people more money. Even though money is obviously important, you get to a certain level where, let's say you're paying someone $100,000. If you pay them $150,000, they're not suddenly going to do 50% more work. It just doesn't work like that. So what's important to understand is that as a leader, you need other mechanisms by which you can unlock the full creative capability of people. And providing a meaningful and inspiring workplace is one of those ways in which you can do that. The challenge, however, is how to do that in an authentic manner. And that's where we can see the quote here of Dr. Gardner. He says that effective leaders have stories that are about themselves and their groups, about where they are coming from and where they are heading, about what was to be feared, struggled against, and dreamed about. In other words, a real master story in an organization is about us. Who are we? What are we trying to fight for? What are we trying to achieve as a team here? What is our organization actually about? And that's where we can see that we face a great challenge. Because already, in some sense, to be very brutal, our bullshit detectors start to tingle. Because we hear that kind of language and we start to say, this person is just going to sell me a whole load of rubbish and it's actually just meaningless. They don't believe in anything. And to be honest, you're right. That is a great danger of our society today. In fact, the postmodern era, which is what we live in today, is characterized at a very basic level by a fundamental lack of trust and authority. So what that means is that our day and age is characterized by our inability to trust people and organizations that are in leadership positions. And that's in stark contrast to previous generations, where there was a lot more trust in the leaders and the organizations and institutions that organized our society. So the collapse of trust in authority and the collapse of trust in our organizations that characterizes the modern day is a major challenge for leaders, because we need to find a way to build authentic and meaningful stories, but to do so in such a way that we overcome the inherent skepticism that people have for us. And that's what we need to look at in terms of this module. So how can we actually make sense of this idea of the master story? Well, in front of you, you can see two different situations. Let's imagine you're the leader of the team and you have Tom, Richard, Natasha, Jane, and Sue in your team. Now, on the left, those individuals are in their own little reality bubbles. They each have their own separate understanding of what our story is in the team. What are we doing? What are we working towards? Why it's important? And what's clear is that they're not unified into one meaningful whole. Now, the challenge with that is that as a leader, it becomes very difficult to unite your people if they all believe in a very different reality. Second of all, it's very difficult to provide a meaningful work environment when everyone's completely disconnected from everyone else, because that means you have to work to create a meaningful environment for 5 different people, and that's going to be very, very difficult. So instead, you focus on creating what's called the master story, and that's what we see on the right. The master story weaves together the different stories of those individuals, but out of that synthesis of stories emerges a we. And that master story basically contains all the elements of the individual stories. And so what we can see here is that the master story is the synthesis of many different stories into one meaningful whole. And that's a crucial concept to the idea of master story, because it's that delicate balance of telling everyone's story, but also making sure that we don't overwhelm ourselves with the details of every individual story. So that takes us to what is a master story. So first we need to understand where the master story comes from. In the previous module, we talked about sense-making, and what we were discussing there is this idea that the act of interpretation creates a story. When you make sense of a situation, you're generating an interpretation of that situation. Now, if you combine those different individual interpretations, you form a story of that situation. In other words, stories are concise descriptions of how extremely complex situations change over time. Now, let's imagine that one individual is engaged in the act of sense-making. They create their own understanding, or in other words, their own story of what is happening in the situation. Now, what we need is to ensure that everyone on our team has the same level of understanding. And so what you need to do is you need to work to combine the stories of each individual into one master story. The trick, however, is to make sure that you continue doing this. That master story needs to be continuously nurtured in order to make sure you maintain the high levels of unity, clarity, and meaning that make a master story so effective. So how can you actually go about building a master story? The first thing I want to address here, before we go into the details, is that I can imagine that you're probably sitting there and feeling slightly skeptical about this. Aren't we supposed to be learning about leadership? Aren't we supposed to be learning about more practical things than simply storytelling? Well, the reality is that this is one of the most underrated areas of leadership, and as a consequence, is one of the things that leaders are worst at. Unfortunately, as I've also previously described, the greatest need that we have in our society and in our workplace is to create a meaningful society. Survey after survey has shown how people feel disengaged from their work environment. They're not passionate, they're not interested, there's a lack of meaning at work. And you're not going to create that meaning by simply giving people money or giving great speeches. That meaning is only created and only lived through the stories that we tell. And that's why it becomes so important to master the art of the master story. If you don't master this art, then you will find it very difficult to create a meaningful work environment for your team or your organization. So let's get started. How do we make a master story? The first thing that we need to recognize is that the master story must come from individual stories. In other words, it's not about you as a leader sitting down on your own and making everything up. because that's going to be completely inauthentic and it's only going to be your opinion on the subject matter. So instead, your task is to collect the diverse stories of your people. So that simply means go out to your people in your team, go out to the people in your organization and listen to their stories about what's happening in the organization. Once you've collected those diverse stories, you need to find a way to effectively synthesize them into one master story. So we've gone from collecting stories to finding a way to synthesize those stories into one master story. Key concepts in that master story are that it has to be coherent and it has to be authentic. Coherent means it has to make sense. You can't just simply bunch together a whole different set of random stories and hope that somehow they make sense. It's not a simple job of just copy-pasting different stories together and saying, right, job done. Your task is to weave those different stories together into a meaningful and coherent whole. The second is it has to be authentic. And the only way that you're going to create an authentic story is if it truly represents what the people feel and think. If you only ask, a select few people who you know are going to say nice things anyway, well, then that's just going to be a typical PR job, isn't it? It's not really going to capture the real essence and dynamism of the organization. So you need to make sure that you go and speak to all the people, all the diverse stakeholders, and synthesize their real stories, not just sugar wash everything to pretend that everything's perfect, in order to build an authentic story. And then thirdly, once that master story is emerging, you need to make sure it's spread, because there's no point simply having that and no one accessing it. You need to distribute the master story amongst the people. So how are you going to do that? So Adepagos has developed a very simple SPA3 model. So what does SPA3 mean? Well, it summarizes the key points that we have here. The S stands for stories, synthesis, and spread. And I've just covered those. You need to collect stories, synthesize those into a master story, and make sure that master story is spread to the people in the organization. How do you do that? Well, the P represents the step one. You need to bring together people, and you need to make sure that out of those people emerges a plot. And you need to focus on what those people are doing. And that's the performance element. So in other words, the people come together, and what's the story of these people coming together? For example, what's the story of your customer service team? What's the story of your marketing team? What's the story of your product development team? What are these people getting up to? That's the plot element. You need to work out what that is. And then finally, you need to find a way to describe the performance. How is that plot coming to life? What are the great, exciting details? What are the funny little facts that people should know? Focus on how the story is performed in the environment. Secondly, we then led to the synthesis stage. We've taken those different elements of stories, so we've got the people, plot, and performance, and we've got all these different stories. We need to synthesize them effectively. That requires 3 priorities: that the synthesis is authentic, that it's accurate, and that it generates high levels of awareness. So authentic I've already touched on before. It needs to be something that people really believe represents their organizational reality. People are smart, and they know when you're going to start bullshitting them. So don't try and pretend to them that everything is perfect when it clearly isn't. That doesn't mean that you have to dive into the negative and say that everything is terrible, but you do need to have the courage to be honest about what is really good and what is really not good, and start building a conversation around them so you can transform the less good things into better things. That ties into the second point of accuracy. How accurate are you being in your description of reality? Now, obviously, every story always has compromises, and it can't be incredibly precise and accurate. But you can't make your story a complete fairy tale. It has to accurately describe what is going on in the organization. The third priority is awareness. Does your story really capture what is happening in the overall organization? Does it raise awareness of how the organization or how the team is actually working? Or have you only focused on one particular thing? Now, the point here, and that's why we're looking at the idea of master story, is not simply to tell a good story. The point is to find a way to unite all the different stories into one master story. And that's why awareness is important. So, for example, if you're only talking about the customer service team, then there isn't enough awareness to talk about the whole organization. You need to make sure that your synthesis includes all the different stories that are important for the organization. So in a standard organization, that would include stories from the finance team, the marketing team, the product development team, the customer service team, so on and so forth. You can't just simply focus on one niche because it's a good story, because we're focusing here on the idea of the master story. and it needs to be something that unites everything. That takes us to the third concept of repeat, renew, and reperceive. So the first thing to understand here is that as a leader, you need to tell this master story over and over again. It might seem incredibly repetitive for you, but you need to keep sending out the same consistent message of what this organization is about. Keep telling its story so that everyone can recognize it. There's no point only telling the story to the customer service team if you don't tell it to the finance team, because only one group then will hear the master story. So you need to go to all your people and repeat the same story. And I know that might sound ridiculous and tiresome and boring, but that is the task of leadership. You need to be able to unite your people into a common story to create a common sense of meaning and purpose. Secondly, renew. Once you've got that master story out there, it also needs to be updated. How, as over 6 months, the organization and the people are going to change. So does the organizational story. The master story needs to change as well. So you need to work on renewing the story so that it always reflects how the organization is actually changing over time. Finally, reperception. So this is quite a tricky concept, but it involves the organization reperceiving itself in what it understands of who it really is. And so a good example of this is Apple. Before Steve Jobs returned to Apple, they were focused on becoming a computer manufacturer. When Steve Jobs came, he reperceived the narrative of Apple. He understood the organization not to simply be a computer manufacturer, but as someone who can transform itself as a player in the digital world. So in other words, it wasn't simply making computers, it was making digital devices that enabled the digital lifestyle. And that's where we saw the organization transform itself to developing things like the iPod, iPhone, and iPad. Now, you might just argue, okay, well, that's just it, shifting its strategy. And, at one level it is. But you need to understand that Steve Jobs needed to sell this story to every single employee in the organization. You can't just simply go in as a leader and say, right, everyone, before you make computers, now you're making iPhones, off you go. That's simply not going to work. That's a naive assumption, one trapped in the 20th century mindset of a leader who believes in simple command and control. If I just tell my people what to do, then they'll jump and do it. You might tell yourself that, but you're going to find that in reality it doesn't work like that at all. Your people will resist your attempts to change them. So instead, what's necessary is to create a story around how can we reperceive our capabilities? How can we reperceive who we really are as an organization in order to make sure that we remain relevant and that we are still going forward to build a really meaningful and effective workplace? So I want to take a moment here to say that I do appreciate that our goal is concise learning and that this learning step is one of the longer learning steps of Leadapreneur Online. However, I do feel that this is one of the most important areas of 21st century leadership and also, unfortunately, one of the least understood. So that's why I think it's important to spend more time on the master story, because it enables you to understand how to create authentic and meaningful work environments in a practical manner. So let's take a moment to briefly look at summarizing where we are at with our understanding of the master story. The master story is important because it provides a clear explanation for what is happening in the organization, and that clarity is crucial. Imagine how complex an organization like Apple is. There is so much going on. You've got hundreds of thousands of people working together across the planet doing so many different things. How can you as a customer, how can you as a leader in the organization or as a shareholder really understand what's going on? Well, you have to rely on the stories that we create in the organization and that we tell about the organization to make sense of it. And so that's why a master story is important, because it unifies all the other independent stories that are happening in the organization and ties them into one clear explanation. Secondly, it provides unified understanding through time. So what's important to recognize here is that a master story not just provides an explanation at one moment in time, but it enables a continuous understanding as the organization changes. So if we compare Apple today with what it was like 10 years ago, it's a very different organization. And yet it is united by the common master story. It is still Apple. It is still that company that pursues technological innovation. It is still that organization that pursues and building pioneering products that transform how people access the digital lifestyle. And so the master story enables us to understand how the organization changes over time. And that's really important. And then finally, and most importantly of all, is that the master story enables us to create an authentic and meaningful workspace. So what that means is the leaders can use the master story as a mechanism by which they can engage people and unite the different people in their organization onto one common platform. So the way that they do that is by talking about Apple as a powerhouse of innovation. We are an organization that delivers cutting-edge innovation and enables our people, our customers, to access a digital lifestyle that without us would be only a dream. And that makes something very meaningful for the employees and for the customers. And what we can notice here is it's not necessary to create incredibly convoluted and complex master stories. It's much more important to focus on the authenticity of it. People are excited by the innovation of Apple and the way that it can enhance people's lifestyles. That's fantastic. So what's important is that the leadership team simply build on that master story of innovation and empowering people with a digital lifestyle in an authentic and meaningful way. So how can you actually go about building a meaningful story? Well, it's as easy as ABC. So sometimes, yes, you can get a bit carried away with your acronyms, but I do think that these three concepts are crucial for improving overall leadership effectiveness. And the key point to recognize here is that between master story and leadership effectiveness is the creation of meaning. If you can create a meaningful master story, then you enable your people to come together and be excited and engaged about addressing the challenges that you face and working together to achieve the overall result. So what do you need to focus on to build a meaningful master story? You don't need to focus on making it incredibly inciting. You don't need to focus on making it lots of funny jokes or anything else like that. Instead, you need to focus on the ABC. Most importantly, it needs to be authentic. Does it really describe the organization as it is? That doesn't mean that you have to whitewash it in terms of saying we are only perfect people who do perfect things, we never make any mistakes. That's not being honest and that's not being authentic. You also don't have to say that we're the worst organization in history. That's not particularly useful either. What you need to do is find the right balance of telling the organization's story as it is. Talk about the things that you strive to do. Talk about your successes. Talk about things that you try to achieve and didn't work out. Have the courage and honesty to really be yourselves and describe your story in an authentic manner. Second of all, is the story believable? You might have an authentic story, but do people actually believe in it? Do they get excited about it? Does it connect to their emotions and really make them feel that I believe in what we're doing and I believe in the grand story of what our organization is working to achieve? What that means in practice is, for example, do the people at Apple, when they work there, do they believe in innovation? Do they really believe in the story of Apple being an organization that enables people to have a great digital lifestyle? And from what I understand of the organization, the answer is largely yes, they do. They do manage to do that. And then thirdly, clarity. Is the story easy to understand? I'm not asking you to write a book. I'm not saying that you need to create a master story in which you have an incredibly complex, Lord of the Rings-esque sort of narrative. That's not necessary. It needs to be simple and it needs to be clear. The reason why this matters so much is it has to be easily understood by everyone. That means your employees, that means your shareholders or other important stakeholders such as customers, and even by yourself. So by focusing on making sure that your master story is authentic, it's believable, and that it's clear, you can empower yourself to create an effective master story. So time waits for no man, and we're running out of time for completing this learning step. But I do want to address some practical steps for ensuring that you're creating effective master stories. So the first is run a story-making session. Remember, the first thing that you need to do is get the different stories together from your people. So you should host a story-making session in which you invite people in your team and your organization to come in and tell you their stories. So that's step one. Practical step two is to ask them specifically about their perspective. You don't want to hear what the official company motto is from your people. You already know what that is. You want to hear their story. So really insist on asking your people to tell them what their perspective is on the organization, what their perspective is on what's happening and why these different things are happening. An important piece of advice here is shut up and listen. You've gone through the effort of asking people to come to you and tell you their story. So that means you need to just sit there and let them talk. It's not about you and your perspective and opinion at this moment. It's about you listening to them. And I can certainly say from my experience, amazing things happen when you just let people talk. Challenge yourself to just sit there and listen to the people. Encourage them sometimes with a yes, and can you explain this in more detail or so on. But overall, your task is to talk as little as possible and let them talk as much as possible. The reason why this is so incredibly powerful is that the people will actually tell you what they think, and they will share with you their real stories, but only if you give them the chance to do that. That takes us to practical step 3. People are going to give you a lot of information, and sometimes it's not going to be so well organized in their own minds. So what you should be doing is, when they finished explaining something, you should ask them if you can just gently summarize what it is that you think that they said. And this is a good way of making sure that you're understanding their perspective correctly, but also shows that you're actively listening to them. So one way you could say this is, my understanding of your story is that XYZ, and you basically repeat to them what you think they said. And by using that approach, you can make sure that you're accurately understanding what the people are saying. So in summary, master stories are made by weaving many stories into one. What that means is that you're working as a leader to listen to the individual stories in your team and organization, and working to synthesize those stories into one greater master story. This story describes, what are we doing as a team? What are we doing as an organization? By creating that master story, you enable the organization to be clearer about itself, to be more united under the umbrella of that master story, and to create an inherently more meaningful environment because people are excited and engaged by the story that they are themselves creating. The way in which you can create a master story is by using the SPA3 model. By mastering the art of creating the master story, pun fully intended there, you will be able to create organizations that have the clarity, unity, and above all, meaningful work environment that is crucial for ensuring success in the 21st century.